Okay, fiscal federalism. Again, why does our national government have so many laws, rules, regulations? Why is it? And it's not, first and foremost, remember when the national government makes a rule, makes a law, makes a program, somebody wanted it. So there's pushback if you try to get rid of it because somebody wants it. And you and I might disagree on what we want or what we should have, and that's what voting is for. But somebody through the years, not you, but through the years, people have wanted a stronger national government. They turn to the national government to solve what they see as problems. And they have different opinions about it. And if you remember about hyperpluralism, if you believe in all these interest groups get a lot of what they want, and therefore you have a larger federal government. Add to that, the federal government has a lot of money and is capable of borrowing money, so they can provide a lot of what these interest groups want throughout the country. But then it comes down to, how do they justify it? How do you justify legally, constitutionally, the right or the ability of the national government to expand and create all these laws? First and foremost, we have implied powers, necessary and proper clause, and especially the commerce clause, because commerce deals a lot with business. The other way is through money, through grants. And I already mentioned that before, and it's already been brought up in this chapter. But here it is more formally. Fiscal money. As you have already seen, shared program costs are a key element of cooperative federalism. Indeed, the second major change in American federalism has been the rise of fiscal federalism, in which grants and aid, federal funds appropriated, handed out by Congress for distribution to state and local governments, serve as instruments through which the national government both aids and influences states and localities. Here, I'll give you a controversy that comes up in my mind. There's debate about the policing, right? The police departments of this country, and whether or not it has too much military vibes to it. And that part of the reason that is the federal government would have extra older military equipment, like military trucks, and they would give them through grants. They would give them to local policing, and with the argument of terrorism, right? But now you see, if there's a protest, all of a sudden, military, what looks like military, is showing up, but it's local police using military, and it's militarizing military equipment, militarizing our local police. And there is been pushback on these programs that allow them to get this military equipment. For what it's worth, we live in different times now, but the founders, the framers, one of the biggest problems they had with the national government was fear of a standing army, that the military could be used against its own people. Okay. But that is a form of cooperative federalism that shows up in the news from time to time. The amount of money spent on federal grants has grown rapidly since the 60s, and especially since the 90s, as you can see in the chart. For 2017, federal grants and aid, including loan subsidies, such as cases in which the federal government pays the interest on student loans until a student graduates, totals more than $694 billion. When we talk about the federal government, keep in mind, we're in the numbers of trillions, not billions. Federal aid covering a wide range of policy areas accounts for about 1/4 of all the funds spent by state and local governments, and for about 16% of all federal government expenditures. So all this money we're talking about is only 16% of the federal government spending. It's not a lot, but I mean, it's a lot, don't get me wrong, but it's not a lot when you consider how much it spends on other items. But it's still 1/4, 25% of state local government spending. So this money, this 16%, is vital to federal and state programs. There are two major types of federal grant and aids for states and local governments, localities. Categorical grants and block grants. You do need to know both. You do need to know the positive and negatives of each. Categorical grants are the main source of federal aid to state and local governments. These grants can be used only for specific purposes or categories of state and local spending. Because direct orders from the federal government to the states are rare, with an exception of the Equal Opportunity Act, most federal regulation is accomplished in a more indirect manner. As you've already seen, Congress attaches conditions to the grants that states receive. Such restrictions on grants have been especially common since the 70s. One string commonly attached to categorical and other federal grants is a non-discrimination provision, stating that aid may not be used for purposes that discriminate against minorities, women, or other groups. Other restrictions may require an environmental impact statement for a federally supported construction project or provisions for community involvement in the planning of the project. So you want the federal money, you're going to have to follow environmental rules. You're going to have to follow non-discrimination rules. If it's a category grant, now probably can understand why some people don't like these grants. They would rather it be a block grant. They don't want all these strings attached. The federal government may also employ crossover. And many find these kind of restrictions, environmental and non-discrimination, extremely important, and that's why they push to keep categorical grants, because they don't trust states to follow the rules that they want them to follow. These are not in there for feel good. These are in there because these strings, because a group of people believe in them, believe it's right to do it, to require it, because otherwise they might not do it. The federal government may also employ crossover sanctions, using federal dollars in one program to influence state and local policy in another. Crossover sanctions are applied when, for example, funds for highway construction are withheld unless states raise the drinking age to 21 or establish highway beautification programs. I don't know anything about that, where those are. You have to look them up. Cross-cutting requirements occur when a condition on one federal grant is extended to all activities supported by federal funds, regardless of their source. The grandfather of these requirements is Title 11 of the 64 Civil Rights Act, which bars discrimination in the use of federal funds on account of race, color, national origin, gender, or physical disability. For example, if a university discriminates illegally in one program, such as athletics, it may lose the federal aid it receives for all of its programs. This is a really big deal. There's a lot of controversies on colleges, and I thought it was Title IX as well. This one's Title 11, but Title IX, the one is in how it's interpreted and how it's used, and the leverage that the federal government and whoever the president and his department, his education secretary are, can be a really big deal, and really challenging. And we'll see when we talk about it later about this change of one president to another and how that can whiplash these programs and requirements back and forth. There are also cross-cutting requirements dealing with environmental protection, historic preservation, contract wage rates, access to government information, the care of experimental animals, the treatment of human subjects in research projects, and a host of other policies. So all of this cross-cutting is, you want money for one program, you're going to have to follow these rules for all your programs. Now, obviously, some people want this. Some people find these too excessive. So it depends on who you talk to, and it probably depends on which particular requirement you're talking about. But always keep in mind, you don't have to take the money. It's a strings attached, and we have found schools find themselves dependent on this money, but they don't have to take it. Or other programs, they can fundraise a different way. So 2 types of categorical grants. Project, most common type, competitive applications, National Science Foundation grants obtained by university professors. So project grants, I got to go to quite a few seminars on really interesting history that I still use today through the Teaching American History grant, the TAH grant. That was cut during the Great Recession years ago. That funding, but our Muskegon County ISD applied for that project grant and funded years of seminars and education opportunities for public school teachers and private school teachers, K-12 teachers. Okay, so, and then the other type of categorical grant, formula. Distributed according to formulas. These formulas vary from grant to grant and may be computed on the basis of population, per capita income, percentage of rural population, or some other factor. A state or local government does not apply for a formula grant. A formula determines how much money the particular government will receive. Vigorous political battles are fought in Congress over formulas. The most common formula grants are those for Medicaid, child nutrition, sewage treatment plant construction, public housing, community development programs, and training and employment programs. Our school gets money, Title I and Title II funding, based on a formula grants of how many of our students are lower income families. So it's called a Title I school. If you're I don't know if all of our buildings are Title I, but I believe all our elementary at least are. So Title I schools are schools that meet the formula to get funding from this grant for programs because enough of our families are qualified for low income. That's a formula grant. Complaints about the cumbersome paperwork and many strings attached to categorical grants led to the adoption of the second major type of federal aid, block grants. These grants are given more or less automatically to states or communities, which then have discretion they can choose within broad areas in deciding how to spend the money. First adopted in '66, block grants support programs in areas like community development that can be used for programs like housing and expanding employment opportunities for persons with lower income. Hopefully you're figuring out politically there's a lot of controversy. States love block grants. Hey, we get to spend the money the way we choose. We're the smarter ones about how we need to spend the money. Give us this money, we will make the good decision. Others would argue that some states are not good at making good decisions, that they don't care enough about the environment, or they don't care enough about non-discrimination. They don't care enough about poverty or people in poverty, or they don't spend the money right. Of course, who gets to decide how the money is spent right is political. And that's where the voting comes in. And again, and I don't know if I said this before, people like states to be in control when they agree with the states. They like the federal government to be in control when they like what the federal government's doing. So you're going to see that with Biden being president, Democrats are going to like national actions, national regulations, national changes, national direction, but they didn't like that under Trump, whereas conservatives, Republicans would be reverse. That's the politics of it. Okay, so the scramble for federal dollars. With $694 billion in federal grants at stake, most states and many cities have established full-time staffs in Washington. Their task is to identify what federal funds are available and to help their state or city obtain some of it. There are many Washington organizations of governments, the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the National League of Cities, for example, that act like other interest groups in lobbying Congress. Senators and reps regularly go to the voters with stories of their influence in securing federal funds for their constituencies. You and I are represented by reps. We are their constituents. Our representative, Bill Huizenga, our senators will want us to know when they got us money that helps for elections. And they would argue it's their job. For example, that Great Lakes one I brought up, the Great Lakes funding, I'm not sure what the programs were. I think there are multiple programs, and they are vital to our area as far as we're concerned. They need continued support at the polls, they say, so they will rise in seniority and keep posts to help bring home the bacon, bring home the money. Despite some variations, on the whole, federal grant distribution follows the principle of universalism, something for everybody. The vigilance of senators and representatives keeps federal aid reasonably well spread among the states. This rough parity makes good politics equal. Everyone's getting it. But it also may undermine public policy. Title I of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act is the federal government's principal endeavor to assist public schools. The primary intent of Title I was to give extra help to poor children, yet the funds are allocated, handed out, to 95% of all the school districts in the country. President Bill Clinton's proposal to concentrate Title I funds on the poorest students failed when it ran into predictable opposition in Congress. Like I said before, I know we get Title I money because in buildings that qualify. They're saying here, and that money also goes to schools that would not fall under poverty. I assume they're right. I'd have to look up and do research on how not all schools are Title I, so I don't know the specifics on how that operates. The mandate blues. The states and localities are usually pleased to receive aid from the national government, but there are times when they would just as soon not have it. For example, say Congress decides to expand a program administered by the states and funded in part by the national government. It passes a law requiring the states to expand the program if they want to keep receiving aid, which most states do. Requirements that direct states or local governments to provide additional service under threat of penalties or as a condition of receiving federal grant are a type of mandate requirement. Congress usually appropriates some funds to help pay for the new policy, but whether it does or does not, the states suddenly have to budget more funds for the program just to receive federal grant money. So an example would be educators, schools often have a complaint that all this testing and data that we have to follow in order to get funding, federal and state, that we don't really have the ability, the time, or the knowledge, the skill set to follow these mandates properly. Yeah, we have to do it for the money, and we want to keep getting the funding, but we don't know, we're not necessarily, we would, how do I phrase this? We would argue that we don't necessarily have the ability to follow the rules of the testing, because it's not only just testing, it's what you do with the test results. So they argue it's an unfunded, there's no money there for the mandate. It's an unfunded mandate. There were schools a few years back that actually sued the state of Michigan for an unfunded mandate for special education programs. If you're going to require certain activities under special education without additional or added funding, added money, the schools argued that you couldn't do that to them. And I believe they won that case. It's been a few years. It's been at least 5 years, so I don't remember the specifics. But the argument is you keep adding on these new rules, but you're not giving local governments, you're not giving police agencies, you're not giving schools, states, you name it. You're not giving them money to carry out these new mandates, these new rules. And they can be really difficult because you've become dependent on the money that's already coming, and now they're going to they're threatening to take the money away that you've become dependent on. Hopefully that makes sense. So Medicaid, which is health care for low-income people, is a prime example. Administered by the states, Medicaid receives wide support from both political parties. The national government pays the majority of the bill, and the states pick up the rest. In the past 20 years, Congress has moved aggressively to expand Medicaid to specific populations: children, pregnant women, and elderly poor under certain income levels. Congress has also increased its funding for the program, but the new requirements have met huge new demands on state budgets. In effect, Congress has set priorities for the states. In 2012, the Supreme Court held that the Affordable Care Act of 2010 had gone too far in requiring the states to further expand Medicaid. Congress can offer money to states to expand Medicaid and can attach conditions to such grants, but it cannot penalize states that chose not to participate in the new program by reducing their existing Medicaid funding. That was the argument of the court. A related problem of federal mandates arises when Congress passes a law creating financial obligations for the states, but provides no funds to meet these obligations. In 1990, Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, requiring states to make facilities, such as state colleges and universities, accessible to individuals with disabilities. But it didn't fund it. It did not allocate funds to implement this policy. Similarly, the Clean Air Act of 1970 established national air quality standards, but required states to implement them and to appropriate funds for that purpose. In an attempt to deal with this problem, in 1995, Congress passed a law requiring the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, to estimate the cost of all bills that impose such requirements. This requirement does not apply to anti-discrimination legislation or to most legislation requiring state and local governments to take various action in exchange for continued federal funding. The law also ordered federal agencies to design new processes to allow for greater input by state and local officials into the development of regulations imposing mandates. Mandates coupled with insufficient federal funds continues to pose problems for state and local governments. Such governments are the first responders in most emergencies. Their police forces provide most of the nation's internal security. They maintain most of the country's transportation infrastructure. And they are responsible for protecting the public's health and providing emergency health care. The heightened concern for Homeland Security since September 11th led Congress to impose sizable new mandates on the states to increase their ability to deal with attacks of terrorism. But Congress has not provided all the resources necessary to increase state and local capabilities. That's actually debatable. Some have argued some of the funding for terrorism was not necessary. You can look that up. Similarly, as we saw, the No Child Left Behind Act threatened school systems with the loss of federal funds if their schools did not improve student performance. But with the loss of but many local officials complained that the federal government did not provide a sufficient increase in funding to help their school system bring about required improvements. Federal courts, too, create unfunded mandates for the states. In recent years, federal judges have issued states' orders in areas such as prison construction and management, school desegregation, and facilities and mental health hospitals. These court orders often require states to spend funds to meet standards imposed by a judge. A combination of federal regulations and inadequate resources may also put the states in a bind. The national government requires that a local housing authority build or acquire a new low-income housing facility for each one it demolishes. But for years, Congress has provided little money for the construction of public housing. As a result, a provision intended to help the poor by ensuring a stable supply of housing actually hurts them because it discourages local governments from demolishing unsafe and inadequate housing. Similarly, a few states have recently rejected some short-term federal aid for unemployment benefits because they did not want to accept the requirements to maintain the benefits in the long term. The federal government may also unintentionally create financial obligations for the states. California, New York, Texas, Florida, and other states have sued the federal government for reimbursement for the cost of healthcare, education, prisons, and other public services that the states provide to illegal residents. The states charged that the federal government's failure to control its borders was a source of huge new demands on their treasuries and that Washington, not the states, should pay for the problem. Although states have not won their cases, their point is a valid one. That's an opinion. I'm not saying it's a wrong opinion. I just want you to know it's an opinion. As you have seen, the federal system assigns states important responsibilities for public policies. An important effect is diversity in policy among the states. One implication is that it is possible for the diversity of opinions within the country to be reflected in different public policies across the states. If the citizens of Texas wish to have a death penalty, for example, they can vote for politicians who support it, even if other states move to abolish it. Should whether you live depend on where you live, look at that above, you are the policymaker. Another effect of the federal system is facilitating policy innovation. The American states have always been policy innovators. They overflow with reforms. From clean air legislation to healthcare, the states constitute a national laboratory. This is actually, this is something that you should know. It's a term that's known in federalism, national laboratories for experimentation, to develop and test public policies, and they share the results with other states and the national government. Almost every policy that the national government has adopted had its beginning in the states. One or more states pioneered child labor laws, minimum wage, unemployment, anti-pollution, civil rights, and the income tax. More recently, states have been active in reforming healthcare, education, and welfare, and the national government is paying close attention. I don't know if that's actually true. The New Deal was FDR's New Deal program during the Great Depression was mirrored by what he had already done in New York, the state of New York. Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, actually is a mirror of the Massachusetts mandate program. So these are a lot of national programs and state programs do come from other states or programs already been enacted. A lot of programs in Michigan, education programs in Michigan, are happening across the country. And we either took it from them or they took it from us. States may also take initiatives on what most people view as national policies when the federal government acts contrary to the views of people within those states. Many states raised the minimum wage when Congress did not. Some states funded stem cell research after George W. severely restricted it on the federal level. Similarly, many states have taken the lead in raising the standards for environmental protection after they concluded that the national government was too lenient. Other states have enacted strict immigration laws to deter, some of this isn't legal, it won't be constitutional to do immigration laws because that is a enumerated power. Regardless, though, it's a good example that people tend to like federalism when they don't want what the national government's doing. They want the state to do something differently, and vice versa. So again, it's often politics. Ask yourself, do you really agree or disagree with the national government doing it? Or do you really just agree or disagree with the president at the time or Congress or that individual action? Views in federalism can ebb and flow based on your view on the national government. Yet another I guess a good example is like threats of seceding. When Obama was president, Texas, you hear people saying Texas should just nullify federal nullification, and which was talked about at the beginning of this chapter, or they should just secede. We should secede from the union. And then under Trump, you're going to see the same argument from the liberals. It depends on who's president. So go ahead and finish this one up, and then understanding federalism. The federal system is central to politics, government, and policy in America. Division of powers and responsibilities between the states and the national government has implications for the themes of both democracy and the scope of government. One of the reasons that the framers established the federal system was to allay the fears of those who believed that a powerful and distant central government would tyrannize the states and limit their voice in government. By decentralizing the political system, federalism was designed to contribute to democracy, or at least in the limited form of democracy supported by the framers. So remember, we have federalism because we wanted a limited national government. Has the federal system, in fact, contributed to democracy? In many ways, the answer appears to be yes. Make sure you read this last part. Actually, I'm going to stop this at 30 minutes here, and I'll do one more bit for this.